Now that's college and career readiness. What do you think? Any college professor who tried to have a discussion with a student about Frankenstein would be puzzled why the student knew nothing about Frankenstein. At any rate, back to Cape Chopin. The story of an hour is one in which this character, whose name is Mrs. Mallard, is told that her husband has just died in an accident. And what Mrs. Mallard does is she tears up for a couple of seconds, feels a little bit of grief, and she goes into her room alone. She stretches out her arms, and she looks at the future and sees that it will belong to her and to her alone. And it gives her a sense of independence and freedom. Now the students, through a lot of prompt questions, are asked what they think of this. They're not asked, how would you like to be the husband of this woman? That is not one of the questions that is asked. That would be the question I would ask, but maybe I have a husband's point of view of this. I'm not sure. But at any rate, there's much ado made about how this was such a strong and bold statement for women at the turn of the century, and how she refused to make her female character any less vigorous and so on. And so she's really praised, and it's clear by all the questions that this story is being built up. And then you have this dialogue that's supposed to take place between the students and the teacher and the students. Ask students, what does Mrs. Mallard's action, the action of doing like this and looking into the future, what does Mrs. Mallard's action symbolize, and how does it affect readers? Possible response. In other words, the response the teacher wants to get out of the students, as programmed by the textbook. Possible response. The action symbolizes Mrs. Mallard's desire for independence. Readers are forced to reflect on the negative aspects of 19th century marriages. Weren't 19th century marriages sort of like marriages? So this is doing a little bit more than reading literature. This is actually calling into question the fundamental institution that supports civil society, which is the family. So what's going on in the Common Core is that it's either complete superficiality and the worst progressive methods of education that have been used and have failed for the last 40 or 50 years, many of them since I was in high school. Or, in fact, we have a complete control over the curriculum which urges a particular political and social dogma on the American people that the American people would never accept if the folks who are in charge were actually honest about what they're doing. What they're actually trying to do, and this is, I have a book. If you all are interested, I have copies back there. I call it the story killers. Because what they're actually doing is they're trying to kill off the stories of the American people. And it's through the stories that we understand who we are. It's through stories that young people learn how to be virtuous, how to be good, how to love, how to be courageous. Stories are the things that build up the human soul. And if you're the person who controls the stories and what the students get taught and how they're supposed to feel, you control the regime. This is not pie in the sky stuff. This is this idea that whoever controls the storytellers controls the regime. That goes back to Plato. And look at the quality of the stories that we're being given, and we know exactly that we're being sold a bill of goods. Thank you.
Take it out some more. Well, I can say one thing. Nobody has dozed off after tonight. You guys are really paying attention and doing a great job. And I'm sure that's exactly what they do on a radio show. They never tune out. They don't leave. They get to work. They stay in the parking lot. Okay, we're going to go now back to Jane Robbins. We're going to talk about data tracking here a little bit, and then just after the top of the hour, we'll continue here with Senator Ligon.
Okay, I hope those windows are locked because I might throw myself out of one. Okay, okay, do this real quickly. I said that to get the race to the top money, which we sold our soul to get, we had to agree to expand our data systems. Well, this actually goes back to the early 2000s when the federal government first started getting involved in getting the states to build out these massive data systems. It predates the Obama administration. But you also, to get money from the stimulus bill, you had to agree to build these very large and identical across the states data systems. It had to be identical. And why do you think the federal government wants the states to build identical data systems? Well, because there is a federal statute that prohibits the federal government from maintaining a national student database. But if you have 57 identical student databases, they can be shared, right? You can share the data across states. And presto, you have a national student database, but it's not managed in Washington, so it's not a federal database. And what kind of data are they talking about? Well, there's something called the National Education Data Model, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education, and they recommend, this is not required yet, they recommend collecting over 400 data points on each child. This would be things like healthcare history, disciplinary history, and all this data is going to stay there. They're not getting rid of it. So if your child has a rough 7th grade year and gets suspended for a few days, it's going to be there forever. Family voting status, family income range, religious affiliation, all kinds of things. It's not, we're not talking about just name, address, and test scores. There's something called the Data Quality Campaign, which the National Education Data Model relies heavily on. Data Quality Campaign is a nonprofit organization that is to help us to get all of our data sort of the same and good quality and everything. And guess who funds the Data Quality Campaign? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, the data people will tell you that there's absolutely nothing to worry about because everything that we do in data is in compliance with federal educational privacy law, which unfortunately has disappeared. There was a federal statute called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. It's been around since 1974, and it still exists on paper. But as of 2 years ago, the Obama administration has gutted it. They did it by regulation, not by statute. They gutted it so that now, without getting into the weeds of this because I don't have time to go into it, but now personally identifiable student data can be shared with virtually anyone in the world without parental consent or even knowledge. The only thing they have to do is to use the right language in justifying the sharing. And this applies not only to the federal government, but to the state government. So the Georgia Department of Education can do with the data whatever it darn well pleases, as long as they say, well, I'm designating this person to be an authorized representative. So he can have personally identifiable data, and the parents will never know that it's going there. Now, there was back when we were in the PARC testing consortium, PARC had a contract with the federal government that required them to allow the federal government access to any data that they got. And so people say, well, now that we're out of PARC, we don't have to worry about that anymore. So our data is not going to go to the federal government. And Georgia DOE says, absolutely not. We would never do this. So are we safe now that we're out of PARC, so we're not subject to that contract? No. We talked to the people in Texas, and Texas is one of the states that did not adopt Common Core, which, according to the Chamber of Commerce and various politicians, means Texas will never get another company to move there because all the companies will only go to Common Core state. Last time I looked, Texas was doing quite well in attracting companies. But the Texas education people tell us that the U.S. Department of Education is very, very aggressive, increasingly aggressive about demanding personally identifiable data. They demand it statewide, even if it's only a tiny little grant. They demand the names. They said, don't worry, we'll strip out the names. The Texas people said, no, thank you. But anybody who thinks that the federal government is going to spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on helping states build their data systems and they're not going to get that data is very naive, I'm afraid. Now, I mentioned the Georgia Department of Education. They have been telling us for years, I guess, no data is leaving the state of Georgia. It's absolutely right here. We are not doing anything else with it. It is safe. You can rest assured. And then we find out through a Google search, and sort of, I wasn't even looking for this. I just tripped over it. There's something called the Southeast Education Data Exchange. And it's an effort. They're putting this together so that states in a particular region, although Colorado seems to be in it for some reason, can share student data, and they say it's for kids who move across state lines. Okay, well, all right, you can make the argument that data, that's a good thing. I personally don't think it's a good thing. I think if my child moves across state lines, they can darn well print out that data and give it to me, and I will give it to the next school. They don't have to be transferring it across the lines. But if you're going to make that argument, maybe you should at least be honest with us. Don't tell us we're not doing it. they don't want you to know what they're doing with it because you might object to it. And it messes everything up. And Tanya will talk a little bit about how difficult it is to find out exactly what they're doing, even though we have, as taxpayers and parents, the right to know what they're doing. But Georgia is the lead state in the Southeast Education Data Exchange. They are going to be, I don't know how far along they are with it, but you can go look it up. Okay, and to bring my little prop here that I take with me everywhere I go, y'all may have seen this report. It was put out by the U.S. Department of Education about a year ago, almost a year ago, called Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance, Critical Factors for Success in the 21st Century. So this report is extremely interesting. It talks about the things that we need to encourage in students, because remember, we're not interested in academic knowledge anymore. If you want to know something, you can Google it. Let's look at what's really important. Let's look at developing the appropriate mindsets and dispositions and all of that. So what is this report talking about? It's talking about how we need to develop students who can show that they can persevere in things. And actually, one of the Common Core math standards requires perseverance, because actually, since you're not actually teaching, especially the younger kids, math, they have to learn to persevere through great adversity. So now, if you're going to develop these characteristics in children, you have to be able to measure it, right? Well, how do you measure it? Okay, this report says that some of the most promising directions are educational data mining and effective computing. Effective with an A, not an E. So what is, I didn't know what effective computing meant. So they define it for us. Discrete emotions, particularly relevant to reactions to challenge, such as interest, frustration, anxiety, and boredom, may be measured through analysis of facial expressions, EEG brainwave patterns, skin conductance, heart rate variability, and eye tracking. And in case you're confused about how one would exactly do that, you can go to the infamous page 44. It's infamous among us geeks who read this stuff. Page 44, it gives you pictures of what they do. How here's a facial expression camera, and here's a pressure mouse. Remember, all this education is going to be on computers. Skin conductance sensor, and so you can measure a child's physiological reactions to the lesson that he's being given, or to the testing, or whatever. Okay, it's interesting, isn't it? Am I telling you that once the testing goes into effect, it's not in effect yet, that our kids are going to be hooked up to these things and have their dispositions measured? I'm not telling you that. That's obviously not going to happen. What I am telling you is that this is the mindset of the people who are in charge of this. They don't see anything wrong with this. I don't know how many thousands of dollars and thousands of hours they spent putting together this report, and they posted it on their website, which means they think it's fine. They don't get why anybody wouldn't be okay with this. If you read the report, it's 100 and something pages. They spend maybe one paragraph talking about potential privacy issues here. They do say that the primary problem with it is that this is not practical for the classroom yet. It's where they want to go. And there's a second report that I'm not going to get into, but I encourage you to Google it. It has a title that still doesn't make sense to me. It's called Expanding Evidence Approaches for Learning in a Digital World. I don't know what that means, but anyway, I read the report. This also came from the U.S. Department of Education. Expanding Evidence Approaches for Learning in a Digital World. And this talks about the glories of digital learning. And this is another thing that is huge in progressive education, because it's no longer sufficient in the 21st century to have just teachers. You've got to have computers and computer platforms, and I'm not talking about just having a virtual lecture from a Hillsdale professor or something, which would be great, or having a book on screen instead of the book on the paper. What I'm talking about is the digital platforms that so many companies are now developing, which are interactive. You know, you prompt the kid in front of a computer, and then you have a prompt and a response, and a prompt and a response, like Pavlov. That's what we're talking about, and that's what this report talks about, and how wonderful all of that can be, because you get, you can collect just so much data from students, because every time there's a keystroke, every response that a child gives, that gives data about what's going on with that student. And they say in this report, they don't want to know what students know, they want to know how they're thinking. I don't want the government knowing how my child is thinking. Maybe I'm very 20th century, but I don't want that. They're collecting, this is called non-cognitive data. Digital exhaust is what some people refer to it. Well, about a year ago, there was a conference in Washington, and it was by the U.S. Department of Education, and it was called Datapalooza. And they invited all of these digital learning companies to come in and talk about all the wonderful things they were doing. And Tanya, bless her heart, sat there and watched